The Phantom of 1971. He sat across from me and didn't know my face. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Bus. July 2024. Boston, Massachusetts. At 72, my life in this small, book-filled apartment was a quiet, well-worn path. My husband, Arthur, had been gone for 10 years now, leaving behind a comforting silence and the faint scent of pipe tobacco in his old armchair. We had no children, so my days unfolded with a gentle rhythm, punctuated by simple rituals. One of them was the morning bus ride downtown, a small pleasure, a steaming mug of black coffee at my favorite little cafe, the rustle of a newspaper, the quiet hum of the city waking up around me. It was my anchor, my predictable, solitary joy. This particular Tuesday, the summer heat was already building, even at 9 a.m. I boarded the usual bus, finding my preferred seat by the window, half hidden by the tinted glass. The bus lurched forward, a familiar motion. I adjusted my reading glasses, ready to lose myself in the morning headlines. Then I looked up, and I saw him. He sat across the aisle, 2 rows ahead. An old man, gray hair thinning at the crown, lines etched deep around his eyes, mapping a lifetime of experiences. But those eyes, I would know those eyes anywhere. A striking, intense blue, still holding a spark of the fierce intelligence I remembered. It was Daniel Kane. Danny. My breath hitched. My heart, usually so steady, performed a violent, erratic dance in my chest. Danny, the name, a whisper from half a century ago, felt shockingly real. The man I had loved with every fiber of my being back in 1971 in the vibrant, chaotic heart of San Francisco. 53 years. 53 years since I'd last seen him. Since our paths had diverged so abruptly, so painfully, leaving a raw, gaping wound in my young heart. He had been my first love, my only truly wild love. A love born in the tumultuous backdrop of student protests, of a generation yearning to change the world. He was charisma personified, an idealist with a revolutionary glint in his piercing blue eyes. I had loved his passion, his unwavering belief in a better future, his reckless courage. I had loved him, unconditionally. Now, here he was, right here, in a Boston bus. Grayer, yes. Wrinkled, certainly, but unmistakably him. The familiar curve of his nose. The way his lips settled into a thoughtful line when he was deep in thought. My mind raced, a chaotic jumble of adrenaline, panic, and overwhelming nostalgia. Should I speak to him? What would I say? Danny, do you remember me? Would he be surprised? Would he be happy? Would he even care? The memories, dormant for so long, surged forward with a visceral force. The scent of patchouli and activism, the protest rallies, the shared dreams, the secret hand-holding under lecture hall desks, the dizzying thrill of our first kiss under a California moon. And then, the crushing, inexplicable pain of his sudden, silent departure. He'd simply vanished, left no note, no explanation, leaving me with a bewildered, broken heart that took years to mend. I watched him, a silent vigil. My whole being was poised, waiting for him to lift his gaze, to meet my eyes, to offer that familiar, lopsided smile of recognition. He sat there, staring out the window, his expression distant, contemplative. He didn't seem to notice me. He didn't seem to notice anyone. The bus rumbled to a stop. He stirred, slowly. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the interior of the bus. For a fleeting second, his eyes met mine and passed right over me. Nothing. No flicker of recognition, no softening of his features, no sudden, startled intake of breath. Absolutely nothing. His eyes, the same piercing blue I remembered, were utterly devoid of recognition. He didn't know me. He didn't see Eloise Mason, the girl who had loved him with every fiber of her being. He saw only a nameless, elderly woman on a bus, just another passenger. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, a brutal, profound punch to the gut after all these years. All these memories I had secretly cherished, woven into the fabric of my quiet life. The unresolved questions, the lingering ache of a first love lost. He didn't just not acknowledge me. He literally did not know who I was. The phantom of 1971, my beloved Danny, was now just a forgotten stranger. The emotional shock was devastating. But beneath the profound disappointment, a strange, quiet liberation began to stir. The past, it seemed, was truly past, and I too was a phantom to him. Chapter 2: Echoes from a San Francisco Summer. The bus continued its journey, but my world had ground to a halt. The bustling streets of Boston blurred outside the window. I clutched my newspaper, unread, its crisp pages now a flimsy barrier against the torrent of emotions washing over me. Disbelief, heartbreak, and then a searing anger. How could he not know me after all we had shared, all we had been? The man who had once claimed to love me, who had promised me the moon, now looked through me as if I were thin air. I got off at my usual stop, but the ritual felt hollow, meaningless. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee at the cafe, usually so comforting, now tasted bitter. I couldn't sit. I couldn't think. I walked aimlessly at first, then purposefully, making my way back to my quiet apartment. I needed to be alone. I needed to sort through this shattering revelation. Back in the safety of my living room, the weight of the moment pressed down on me. I sank onto my old velvet armchair, the very one where Arthur used to read. And then, without consciously willing it, my mind retreated. Back to 1971, San Francisco, the summer of love extended. I was 20 then, a wide-eyed English Lit student, newly arrived from a conservative New England town. Thrown headfirst into the swirling vortex of Haight-Ashbury. The air vibrated with revolution, with music, with the scent of incense and possibility. And there, amidst the protests and the poetry readings, I found Danny. He was 22, a philosophy student, with a booming laugh and eyes that saw straight into your soul. He was a natural leader, organizing rallies against the war, debating for hours in smoke-filled cafes, his passion infectious. We met at a poetry slam, our eyes locking across a crowded, vibrant room. He read a poem about freedom, about breaking chains, and I was utterly captivated. We fell into a whirlwind romance, a love affair fueled by shared ideals and the intoxicating thrill of youth. We spent endless hours talking, dreaming, planning. We would change the world together. We would write, we would teach, we would fight for justice. Our love felt cosmic, inevitable. He was my universe, and I his. I remembered his small, cluttered apartment near Golden Gate Park, filled with books, protest posters, and the lingering scent of stale coffee and marijuana. We cooked together, badly. We slept wrapped around each other, dreaming of a future where love and peace reigned. He taught me to question everything, to speak my mind, to believe in the power of one. I grounded him sometimes, pulling him back from the precipice of his wilder schemes. We were a balance, a perfect, young, passionate balance. And then, nothing. One morning, I went to his apartment. The door was unlocked. His few belongings were gone. No note, no warning, just an empty space where he had been. I waited. I called everyone we knew. No one had seen him. No one knew where he had gone. He had simply vanished, leaving me with a shattered heart and a million unanswered questions. It took years to heal, to build a life with Arthur, a kind, steady man who offered me a quiet, dependable love. I never truly forgot Danny, though. He remained, a vivid, aching scar on my heart, a ghost of a love that had never truly found its resolution. Now that ghost had reappeared, in a Boston bus, and he hadn't even recognized me. A sudden fierce urge seized me. I needed answers. Not from him, not directly, not yet, but from my past. I walked to the small, dusty attic room, a forgotten corner of my house. Tucked away in a cedar chest under old quilts and childhood memorabilia was a single, shoebox-sized container. My time capsule, my shrine to 1971. I lifted the lid, the scent of old paper, of faded photographs, of dried flowers wafted up. Inside, a jumble of yellowed newspaper clippings of protests, handwritten poems from Danny, ticket stubs from concerts, pressed flowers from Golden Gate Park, a small, intricate silver ring he had given me, and dozens of faded photographs. Photographs of a younger me, with long, unbound hair and defiant eyes. Photographs of Danny, his face vibrant, alight with passion, his arms slung casually around my waist. We were so young, so full of life, so sure of our future. I held a picture of us, smiling, arms linked, in front of a protest banner. His eyes, so blue, so piercing, the same eyes I had seen in the bus, the same eyes that had looked right through me. A profound sense of loneliness settled over me. This man, the embodiment of my youthful dreams, the one who had shaped me in ways no one else had, was now a stranger. The knowledge that he didn't remember me was a heavy weight, but it also offered a strange kind of freedom. The past was truly, irrevocably gone, and perhaps it was time for me to let it go too. But how? How did one truly let go of a phantom love that had just reappeared, only to vanish again? The answer, I realized, lay not in forgetting, but in understanding. Chapter 3. The Secret Vigil. The revelation that Danny had not recognized me was a complex wound. It burned with a fresh agony, yet also offered a strange, bitter clarity. The past, which I had carefully preserved in my attic time capsule, was not just gone. It was erased, at least for him. The dream of a future where we might reconcile, or at least explain, had vanished in the fleeting gaze of his unseeing eyes. But the anger, that fierce, surprising anger that had flared within me, refused to subside. How could he forget? Was he so self-absorbed, so consumed by his own life, that he could simply jettison our shared history? Or was there something else? A new obsession took root, a secret vigil. I began to adjust my morning routine. I took the same bus, at the same time, positioning myself strategically, usually a few rows behind him or on the opposite side of the aisle. I watched him. He was always there, like clockwork. He had changed, of course. His movements were slower, a slight stiffness in his gait as he boarded the bus. His hands, once strong and expressive, now trembled slightly as he held his newspaper. His profile, once sharp and defiant, was softened by age, yet the core of him remained. The way he pursed his lips in concentration when reading, the slight furrow between his brows when he stared out the window, lost in thought. It was undeniably him, my Danny. I observed him carefully, my heart a mixture of longing and trepidation. He would always get off at the same stop, near a small, leafy park in the Beacon Hill area. He'd walk to a cozy-looking cafe, a place with outdoor seating. He'd order the same thing, black coffee, no sugar, no cream. He'd sit there for an hour, sometimes two, nursing his coffee, reading the paper, or simply gazing into the middle distance. I'd sit at a table inside or across the street, a book open in my lap, pretending to read, but my eyes always drawn to him. I noticed small things. Sometimes he'd forget his glasses on the table, only to search for them frantically. Sometimes he'd fumble with his wallet, counting out coins slowly. Once, I saw him struggle to find his bus pass. His brow furrowed in confusion until the bus driver patiently pointed it out. A new, unwelcome thought began to form. Was it just forgetfulness? Or was it something more? A more profound erosion of memory? The possibility of early-stage dementia, or perhaps Alzheimer's, gnawed at me. The thought filled me with a fresh wave of grief. This one for the man he was, and the man he might be becoming. The anger I had felt softened into a profound pity, mixed with a deeper, more complicated sorrow. If he truly couldn't remember, if his mind was betraying him, then his non-recognition wasn't a deliberate slight. It was a tragic symptom. The secret vigil continued for weeks. I learned his routines, his subtle habits. I watched him from afar, a silent guardian, a specter from his forgotten past. But watching wasn't enough. It only amplified the unanswered questions, the desperate need for closure. If his memory was failing, this might be my last chance. My last chance to hear his voice, to understand why he left, to finally put an end to the story that had haunted me for over half a century. I had tried searching for him online years ago, after Arthur died, but Danny had always been fiercely private, wary of government, of systems. He wasn't on Facebook. He had no public LinkedIn profile. He was a phantom in the digital age, just as he was a phantom of my past. But then a memory sparked. He had been close to a handful of fellow activists, revolutionaries, dreamers. One name in particular surfaced: Margaret Davies, a fiery young woman, a brilliant artist who had once lived in the commune Danny and I frequented. If anyone knew where he had gone or what had become of him, it would be Margaret. I began to scour the internet, not for Danny, but for Margaret. It took days, sifting through old activist forums, university alumni lists, even obscure historical societies. Finally, on an obscure Facebook group dedicated to Bay Area counterculture of the 1970s, I found her. A recent post celebrating her 75th birthday and a name: Margaret Davies, still in San Francisco, still an artist. My hand hovered over the keyboard, to reach out, to dredge up a past that had been buried for so long. It felt like an immense risk, a trespass. But the alternative, to let Danny disappear again, this time forever, without ever understanding, was simply unbearable. I took a deep breath and sent her a message. The next step, the biggest step, would be hers to take, and mine to finally face the truth. Chapter 4. A Bridge Across Decades. The message sent to Margaret felt like a stone dropped into a deep well. Would she even remember me? Would she dismiss me as a crazy old woman clinging to the past? The anxiety gnawed at me for days. Then a reply, short but clear. Eloise? Eloise Mason? My God, is that really you? Where have you been? Of course I remember you. What a blast from the past. You're in Boston now? What a surprise. What can I do for you? Her warmth was immediate, familiar. It was the same Margaret, still vibrant, still direct. I spent hours crafting my reply, carefully, delicately. I told her about seeing Danny on the bus, about his lack of recognition. I admitted my fear about his memory, my desperate need for closure. I explained that after all these years, I needed to understand why he had left so abruptly. Her response came quickly, filled with a surprising empathy. Oh, Eloise, my heart aches for you. Yes, it was Danny. I know he's in Boston. And yes, he's been having some memory issues. Not Alzheimer's, thankfully, but the doctors call it mild cognitive impairment. It affects faces sometimes, names, recent events. But the deep emotional memories, those often stick. He's been through a lot, sweetheart. A lot you don't know. She then explained. After he vanished from San Francisco, Danny had been on the run. His activism had escalated, taking a more radical turn. He had been involved in some actions that crossed a line, drawing the attention of federal authorities. Nothing violent, she stressed, but enough to warrant a serious manhunt. He had been forced to disappear completely, to cut all ties, to protect those he loved, including me. He hadn't wanted me caught in the crossfire. He had genuinely believed that disappearing without a trace was the kindest thing he could do. He had spent years underground, moving from city to city, always looking over his shoulder. He eventually surfaced, decades later, when the statute of limitations had run out and the immediate threat had passed. He had found a quiet life in Boston, working for smaller, local nonprofits, still dedicated to social justice, but in a more subdued, less confrontational way. He had never married, never had children. He had, Margaret said, always carried the weight of his past and the memory of me. The truth, when it finally came, was a tsunami of emotion. Relief, understanding, profound sadness for the life he had been forced to live, and a piercing recognition of his sacrifice. He hadn't abandoned me. He had protected me. His silence wasn't indifference. It was a desperate act of love. He talks about you sometimes, Eloise, Margaret confided in a follow-up call, especially when his memory is clearer. He talks about the San Francisco girl with the bright eyes and the fierce spirit. He regrets the way he left you. He always said it broke his heart. He'd be so happy to see you, if you're willing. My heart hammered. Willing? After all these years? The answers had flooded in, but now a new set of questions arose. What would I say to him? What did I even want from him? Forgiveness? Explanation? Closure? Or did I, secretly, still harbor a flicker of that old love, hoping for something impossible? Margaret, sensing my hesitation, offered a solution. I'm coming to Boston next month for a gallery opening. I can arrange a chance meeting at his usual cafe. Just an introduction. No pressure. You can decide then. The decision weighed on me. The thought of facing him, knowing all the years, all the unspoken words, all the pain, was terrifying. But the alternative? To let this final opportunity slip away, to remain forever haunted by the Phantom of 1971 was even more so. I agreed. The weeks leading up to the meeting were a blur of nervous anticipation. I meticulously chose my outfit, a simple, elegant blue dress, the same shade as his eyes. I wore the small silver ring he had given me, carefully polished, now nestled comfortably on my aged finger. A symbol, a memory, a silent question. On the appointed morning, my hands trembled as I boarded the bus. He was there, as always, sitting in his usual spot, looking out the window. He was just an old man, lost in his thoughts. But to me, he was the repository of my youth, my first love, a lifetime of unanswered questions. The bus pulled up to his stop. My heart pounded. This was it, the bridge across decades. I watched him disembark, his slow, deliberate steps carrying him towards the cafe. I followed, a ghost finally stepping into the light, ready to face the man who had loved and lost me, and perhaps forgotten me. Ready to finally hear the end of our story. Chapter 5: The Unspoken and the Unforgettable. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, usually so comforting, now hung heavy with anticipation. Margaret was already waiting inside the cafe, perched at a small table by the window. She waved me over, her smile warm and encouraging. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. "He's just ordered his coffee," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "He's sitting outside, by the chestnut tree." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. This was it, the moment I had dreamed of, feared, and longed for over 50 years. I walked out to the patio. He was there, exactly as I had seen him in my secret vigil, sipping his black coffee, the newspaper folded neatly beside him. His profile, etched against the morning light, was both familiar and heartbreakingly foreign. Margaret cleared her throat, a little too loudly, as we approached his table. "Danny, good morning. Look who I ran into." He looked up, his blue eyes still holding that distant, contemplative gaze. "Margaret, hello." He then turned to me. His expression was polite, but utterly blank. The flicker of recognition I desperately hoped for simply wasn't there. My stomach dropped. He really didn't know me. The painful truth confirmed again. "Danny," Margaret continued, her voice bright, "this is an old friend from our San Francisco days. You remember Eloise? Eloise Mason?" His eyes, those beautiful, deep blue eyes, widened almost imperceptibly. A slow, agonizing process began on his face. The polite blankness slowly, painfully melted away. His brow furrowed in concentration. His gaze intensified, sweeping over my face, lingering on my eyes, then my silver ring. A spark, then a flicker, then a low, burning flame. "Eloise?" he whispered, his voice hoarse, disbelieving. The name, my name, from his lips, after all these years, felt like a sacred incantation. "My God, Eloise? Is that truly you?" Tears welled in his eyes, and in mine. The years, the distance, the memories, the pain, they all dissolved in that single, shared moment of recognition. This wasn't just a stranger on a bus anymore. This was Danny, my Danny, and he remembered. At least a part of him did, the most important part. "Yes, Danny, it's me," I managed, my voice choked with emotion. He reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly as he grasped mine. His touch was warm, familiar, a jolt from the past. You look, you're still beautiful," he murmured, his gaze sweeping over my face as if trying to memorize every line, every wrinkle, every trace of the girl he once knew. We talked for hours, haltingly at first, then with increasing ease. He spoke of his life after San Francisco, the years underground, the constant fear, the quiet work he continued in social justice, never truly abandoning his ideals. He spoke of loneliness, of regret, of the choices he had to make. I spoke of my life, Arthur, my beloved husband, my teaching career, the quiet joy of a stable life. I spoke of the memories of San Francisco, how they had shaped me, how they had remained vivid, sometimes painful, always dear. Then, cautiously, carefully, I asked the question that had tormented me for 50 years. Danny, why? Why did you leave? Without a word, without a goodbye. He took a deep breath, his eyes filling with tears. I couldn't, Eloise. I truly couldn't. It wasn't because I didn't love you. God, I loved you more than life itself. But I was in deep trouble, deeper than I ever let on. The authorities were closing in. I had information that could have put many people in danger. And if they linked me to you, if they thought you knew anything, your life would have been ruined. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't drag you down with me. Breaking contact completely was the only way I knew to protect you. It broke my heart, Eloise. Every single day, I thought about you, all the time. But I truly believed it was for your own good. I thought you'd move on, find someone stable, a safe life, a good life. His words, raw and honest, were the balm my soul had craved for decades. He hadn't abandoned me out of indifference or cruelty. He had left me out of a desperate, agonizing act of love. He had chosen my safety over his own happiness, over our shared future. The pain of his departure remained, but now it was understood, transformed into a profound, bittersweet acceptance. We spent the rest of the afternoon reminiscing, filling in the gaps of half a century. The moments, the faces, the inside jokes, they all came flooding back, punctuated by laughter and tears. He still had the same spark, the same fierce intellect, though sometimes his train of thought would derail, or he'd repeat a story he'd just told. His mild cognitive impairment was evident, but it was overshadowed by the profound joy of reconnection. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cafe patio, he looked at me, his blue eyes shining. "I'm so glad you found me, Eloise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. You were my star, my bright, beautiful star. I never forgot that." The irony, of course, was that he had forgotten me, briefly, on that bus. But the deeper truth was he hadn't, not where it truly mattered. We both knew that our romantic love, a wild, passionate flame from a bygone era, could not be rekindled. Too much time had passed. Our lives had taken different courses, and his fragile memory, his quiet struggles, meant that a new kind of relationship, a different kind of connection, was perhaps all that was possible. But it was enough, more than enough. It was closure. It was peace. It was a second chance at a different kind of love. Chapter 6: The Unfolding Tapestry of Time. The reunion with Danny transformed my quiet life. The unanswered questions that had simmered beneath the surface for decades finally resolved, allowed a profound peace to settle over me. The pain of his sudden departure in 1971, once a raw wound, now healed into a scar that, while still visible, no longer ached with bitterness. We began a new ritual. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, I would still take the bus downtown. But now, instead of observing him from afar, I would meet Danny at his usual cafe. We would sit, two septuagenarians, sipping black coffee, sharing stories, and bridging the chasm of time. Our conversations were a tapestry woven from threads of the past and the present. He spoke of his covert years, the loneliness, the constant vigilance. He recounted stories of the social justice movements he continued to support, albeit from the sidelines. His passion for a better world, though tempered by age and experience, still burned bright. He sometimes repeated anecdotes or lost his train of thought, but I listened patiently, gently guiding him back, cherishing every moment, every word. I, in turn, shared my life with Arthur, the calm, stable love that had healed my broken heart. I spoke of my students, the joy of teaching literature, the small triumphs and quiet joys of a life well lived. He listened, his eyes warm, occasionally reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. A silent acknowledgement of the life I had built, a life that in some way he had enabled by his sacrifice. He never explicitly apologized again for leaving. There was no need. His presence, his quiet remorse, his willingness to share his vulnerable past, that was apology enough. And I too found myself offering unspoken forgiveness. Forgiveness not just for him, but for myself, for the young woman who had carried that burden for so long. To forgive was to release myself from the chains of resentment and regret. One crisp autumn morning, as we sat watching the leaves fall in the park across from the cafe, Danny turned to me, his blue eyes soft. "You know, Eloise," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "I used to think my biggest regret was not being able to finish changing the world. But now, I think my biggest regret was losing you. And my biggest blessing is having you back, even for just these mornings." Tears pricked my eyes. His memory might falter with faces, with recent events, but the core of our connection, the essence of our shared youth and love, remains stubbornly, beautifully intact. He remembered me. He remembered us. And that was all that truly mattered. We never pursued a romantic rekindling. The time for that had passed, gracefully, irrevocably. Our lives were too different, too shaped by separate journeys. And his memory issues, though mild, meant a deeper partnership might be fraught with challenges. But what we found was something perhaps even more precious, a profound, platonic love rooted in shared history, deep understanding, and unwavering affection. A friendship that had miraculously spanned half a century, defying distance, silence, and even the cruel erosion of memory. I continued to take the bus, but now the sight of it no longer evoked a pang of loss or a phantom memory. It was simply a means to a beautiful reunion. I understood that love, true love, doesn't always take the form we expect. It doesn't always lead to a perfect storybook ending. Sometimes it reshapes itself, becoming something quieter, deeper, more resilient. It becomes part of the very fabric of your being, a gentle hum that resonates through the years. In my journal, I wrote, "Love is not just passion or possession. It is recognition. It is forgiveness. It is understanding. It is the willingness to rebuild, even when the foundations have crumbled." I loved him in 1971 with all the fire of youth. In 2024, I love him differently, more profoundly, for the man he became, for the sacrifices he made, and for the serendipity that brought us back together, even if he didn't recognize me at first glance. Our story is not a tragedy of forgotten love, but a testament to its enduring, transformative power. Sometimes, the greatest love stories are not about finding forever, but about finding resolution and the quiet beauty of a second chance at connection.